hate to be sick and do this and listen to y'all sniffle. Y'all listening to me sniffle this whole entire time, but I'll try and keep that down as best I can. Well, this is our second week in the book of Samuel. We've titled it Influence, How Our Life Impacts Others, because that is much of what 1 Samuel is about. 1 Samuel, the primary character, and we'll come to this here in a moment, is Saul. And Saul had a great impact upon the nation and everything that would take place in the years to come for Israel. And so 1 Samuel is a lot about that, but Saul had a lot of influence, and he used it in some good ways. He used it in some bad ways, especially at the beginning of his kingship. You know, there were some men that wanted to go and kill a bunch of the other prophets, and Saul stood up and said, no, don't do that. We're here to gather together and serve the Lord, to fight off our enemies. Don't do that. We don't need to do that. And so his life had an impact on others. He influenced others. Well, we gave an introduction last week. We want to finish up some of that today. And as we looked at last week, we looked at the time. The time is about 1100 to, the book of 1 Samuel is about 1100 to 1000 BC. But it starts a period that's going to be what we would call Israel's kingdom period, or Israel's monarchy. That ran to about 600 BC. Even though you do have the divided kingdom, still it's the time of the kings of Israel and Judah. And so it's going to start a several hundred-year period in this book, about 575 years. But it brings us out of a 400-year period of the time of the judges as well. Now, we talked about the author last week. I won't recount that. We don't know specifically, but we do know Samuel probably had some impact on that, because Samuel, the Bible tells us in the Chronicles, wrote some things along with the prophets Gad and Nathan, and many people believe that probably 1 Samuel's compilation of those things. For one, we know that Samuel couldn't have written everything because Samuel was dead by midway through the book. So, you know, things that happened between David and Saul, with David on the run from Saul, Samuel wasn't around for those things. And so obviously there was somebody after him that wrote those things. And a good chance that Samuel wrote the first part of the book, and then Nathan and Gad filled in the blanks following that, and they were compiled. Maybe David had them compiled. Maybe one of those other prophets, Nathan or Gad, maybe Ezra. Ezra was known for compiling much of the Old Testament in the order we have it today, and some of the books and so forth, and maybe he was part of that. We don't know. But we do know that God was ultimately the author. All Scripture is given by inspiration of God, and that's how we got it ultimately. Well, started off last week, we talked about the setting. We talked about the setting is, first of all, the end of an era as Israel transitions from the judges to the time of the kings. And so that time of the judges is ending, and Samuel is the last judge of Israel. That is kind of the setting, the theme that you first come to when the book opens. And what characterizes the time of the judges? Well, every man is doing that which is right in his own eyes. And we're going to see that in Eli the priest. Even in Israel's choosing of their first king, Saul, that's pretty evident there. But in spite of that, and in the horrible picture, dark picture that is picturing there, we do have people like Hannah. Now, Ruth takes place during that time as well, so Ruth is a great picture of hope and people who still serve God even when people around them weren't. But as you come to 1 Samuel, you have Hannah, and Hannah is serving God. Hannah does what the Bible God told her to do, the Bible tells her to do. And so even though you have a horrible era, a horrible time in Israel's history, you still have people who are good and godly during that time. But it's the end of that period of time as these judges who ruled really as mediators for Israel. God worked through them to bring deliverance to Israel. That time is now ending as Samuel passes off from the scene. Well, that brings us to the second setting that we have. So the book opens up for the first couple chapters to this time of the judges, transitions into a king and a kingdom time. Now, the time of the kings, as you know, altered Israel as a nation a great way. Israel was always a nation since God founded it through Abraham. You have the beginning of the nation, Abraham's the father, and so forth. So I'm not saying that it was the beginning of the nation, but you have this kingdom idea being established. Israel being established as the kingdom, which they were not before. They were just a nation were originally supposed to be priests. Now they're just a nation of tribes. They were called to serve God, called to represent God. But the time of the kings and the ushering in of the kingdom altered Israel as a nation, and that the character as their nation not only changed, but their relation and interaction to God and how he dealt with them changed in some ways as well. again, as the judges pass off on the scene, you see a transition from God speaking through judges to God speaking through prophets. And throughout the time of the kings, you see a lot of that. Nathan the prophet approached the king. All throughout the Old Testament scriptures leading forward, you'll see these prophets approaching the kings, giving them a message, because they are the representatives of the nation from then on. Whereas before, you had the judges. God would speak to the judges, and they would declare to the people. Now prophets are speaking to kings who are supposed to alter the nation or change the direction of the nation. Again, you see some of those aspects of influence happening there. I want to read to you very quickly as we're thinking on that thought and how it changed Israel. This going from this kind of nation ruled by judges to this nation ruled by kings. We see some of that in 1 Samuel chapter 8. 1 Samuel chapter 8, I just want to read a couple of the verses here, about a dozen, and you'll get a picture of this. So verse 1 says, "And it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel." And actually, I'm going to skip down to some verses here. So verse 5, "And he said unto him, and they said unto him," that's Israel, "Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed unto the Lord. And the Lord said unto Samuel, Hearken unto the voice of the people, and that all that they say unto thee. For they have not rejected thee, but have rejected me, that I should not reign over them." So see that change? Before, God was kind of ruling over them. Though there was judges, God was still ruling over them. Now it's kind of a direct line through a king, and the king's going to have a lot of responsibility. As you look through Chronicles and you see some of the very wicked kings, God went to who? The kings. The prophets went to who? The kings. Rather than all the people kind of getting the message, the king got the message, and it was his change of heart that would alter the direction of the nation. So we're seeing some of that change here. Verse 8, "According to all the works which they have done since the day I have brought them up out of Egypt, even on this day wherewith they have forsaken me and served other gods, so do they also unto thee. Now therefore hearken unto the voice. Howbeit yet protest solemnly unto them, and show them the manner of the king that shall reign over them." And Samuel told all the words of the Lord unto the people that asked him of a king. And he said, "This will be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons, and will appoint them for himself, for his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and some shall run before his chariots. And he shall appoint him captains over thousands, and captains over 50s, and will set them to ear his ground, and to reap his harvest, and to make his instruments of war, and instruments of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be confectionaries, to be cooks and bakers, and your fields and your vineyards, your olive yards, the best of them, and give them unto his servants. And he will take the tenth of your seed and your vineyards, and give them to his officers and to his servants. He will take your men servants, your maid servants, your goodliest young men, your asses, and put them to his work. And he will take the tenth of your sheep, and you will be his servant, or ye shall be his servants, and ye shall cry out in that day because of your king, which ye shall have chosen you, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, Nay, but we will have a king over us, that we may," notice here, "may be like all the nations." Again, they weren't that way before. Now they're going to be like all the nations. Sorry, I lost my verse. "That we may be like," verse 20, "all the nations, and that our king may judge us, and go out before us, and fight our battles." Samuel heard all the words of the people, and he rehearsed them in the ears of the Lord. I'm going to end there. But again, you see, Samuel's telling them, hey, this is going to alter who you are as a people. As a nation, you're not going to be the same. And so, again, the setting is a change in a scene to God ruling them to now a king ruling over them. And exactly as he says, you're going to be servants. You are going to serve this king. Again, before, during the time of the judges, when they had to give a tithe to the Lord, that was all. So they gave a tenth of their first fruits and so forth to the Lord. But now they're going to, what does Samuel say? You're going to give a tenth to this king as well. So now instead of just giving up 10% of your income, you're going to have to give up 20% of your income. It's going to cut in your income. And not only that, are you going to give of your income, but you're going to give of your fields and of your crops and so forth. You're even going to give of your children. Your children are going to be given over for this king and the kingdom. And so again, that's the time of the king and kingdom period, and it's a big transition from what they were. It redefined the nation, we might say, as who they were as a people. But the time of the kings also, and we'll see this beginning in 1 Samuel, I want to say 2 Samuel, 1 Samuel, is that Israel went from a small nation of just tribes. Remember, when Israel left Egypt and went in the wilderness. A lot of them died in that 40-year period. But after that 40-year period, during the time of the numbering, the book of Numbers, there was about 660,000 men that were numbered. So that was about their size. They weren't a big nation at that time because a lot of them, again, had died in the wilderness. They weren't large compared to a lot of nations that were around them, like the Egyptians and so forth. And so they're a small nation just made up of tribes. But now, as the kingdom period kind of begins, they're going to multiply and grow quite quickly and become a greater kingdom rather than just a small nation of tribes. And if you think back to that time of period of history, you have a lot of tribes that were nomadic and so forth. And now Israel's no longer that. They're not going from one patch of grass to others within the nation of Israel. Now they're kind of settled. They're building these fortresses. They're building these kingdoms and so forth. And so they're changing as a nation. And again, they're going to crumble now. Now they began as just a small tribal nation, go to a kingdom. That falls apart, and they go back, and now they're just a small nation without the tribal aspect when you get to the book of Ezra and so forth. What's also interesting, I think, about this time of the king and the kingdoms is you see a lot of bloodshed, not just in Israel's wars against their enemies, because even when Israel left Egypt, they went into Canaan, and they fought a lot of wars and took over the land. But you're going to see a lot of internal wars now because of the fact that you have a kingdom. When it was just tribes, there wasn't as much strife. But now that there's a kingdom, there's going to be a lot more civil war, a lot of bloodshed internally, and even in relation to just the governmental issues. You think about all that took place in David's time, the killing of Abner and Joab and Absalom, and just a lot of government officials, a lot of bloodshed within the nation because of their cry for a king and a kingdom. Well, we see that, a lot of bloodshed as well during this setting, this king, this kingdom. And in fact, you see it with Saul pursuing David. He's trying to kill David, trying to slay one of their very own people, whereas before, that had almost been unthinkable. Within the tribe of Israel, we don't want to kill another tribe. We don't want to kill all of our own people. But now there's jealousy. Now there's a kingdom. There's something they have to defend, so to speak, position and a palace and riches and goods. And so there's a lot more jealousy, a lot more civil strife now that there's a kingdom. Other than a few times of rebellion that God punished Israel with death, they had not known a lot of internal strife. There was a few times, there was a few things that happened within the nation, but the nation kind of stood up together. I think about during the time of the Judges. Remember, there's that concubine that was abused. The guy cut her up into 12 pieces, and then the whole entire nation of Israel went and pursued the tribe of Benjamin and went and basically killed all of them but 400 men. However, you still see there's a cohesiveness of the nation itself together, and basically we're going to get rid of this sin in our nation. Whereas now you move into the kingdom period, it's not about doing right, it's about jealousy. And I'm going to cut off this person's head because he's taken my position from me, or he wants to be in charge of this, or I'm going to go, take this farmer's field. You think about Ahab and Naboth because I want it. So there's a lot of internal strife now. And I mentioned before, they had not known taxation or servitude to their own people until the time of the kingdom. And now the king would demand taxes for projects for luxury. Think with me forward past this time of 1 Samuel and the time of Solomon. Solomon had reign. It came to the time of Rehoboam, his son, reigning. They said, hey, lighten up the load. Lighten up the taxes, lighten up the burdens, your demands upon the people, and you'll rule and reign this kingdom. And of course, we know Rehoboam said, no, I'm going to tax you more. I'm going to burden you more. You're going to be in greater servitude to me and as your king. And of course, he lost the kingdom because of that. And so they had not known those sort of things before, and now they're going to enter into this time that is very demanding on them for their finances, for their people, for their lives, and so forth. While it might have elevated Israel for a temporary time, this time of the kings, we can say this: they were better off under the theocracy, under just serving God as their king, than they were under the time of the kings. And you say, how so? Well, God protected them from their enemies. They didn't have to rely on the king. They could just cry out to God, and God would rush in and save them. Whereas now, they got to hope this king has skill. Sometimes they didn't. You got to hope that this king can help deliver you, and you're putting trust more in a king instead of trusting in God, who is all-powerful, who is all-knowing, who could defend them instantly. And so, again, they've had a great loss in this transition from this theocracy to this monarchy, to this time of the kings. While the king we mentioned last week was a plan of God intended that Israel would eventually have kings through the promised prophecy of Judah's line. Remember, I think it's Genesis 49, Jacob prayed a blessing over Judah and said, hey, the scepter's not going to depart. God also told Israel in Deuteronomy that, hey, you're going to have kings at some point in time, and here's some laws and some rules that they need to follow. However, it was not God's time yet, and that's the issue. That's what brought in much of the civil strife and some of the things that would take place, is because they didn't do it God's way. Eventually, God would have raised up his own king. Who knows? It might have been David. In fact, God would raise up David, obviously, after Saul. But in God's timing, God would have brought about a king. Instead, they wanted it on their own timing. So that's the issue there, and why the kingdom at this time was such a bad issue. Now, God worked through all that. It wasn't like God was taken by surprise, like, oh, I didn't know they would want a king. God knew all the way back that you're going to want a king. He promised them in Deuteronomy, you're going to ask for a king, and I'll give you one. So God wasn't taken by surprise, but God knew the hearts of men. God had a perfect plan, but said, hey, you have the choice, and here's the options. And, of course, they took the wrong choice. Even here with Samuel, we just read it here in chapter 8. Go tell the people this is what's going to happen. You can change your mind now. Either change it or there's no turning back. And, of course, they said, nope, we want a king, even after Samuel told them all that would come to pass. And so that's the settings, this kingdom that's being ushered in that's going to bring some strife, a lot of demand upon the people, a lot of burden upon the people that probably they didn't think about when they really first asked for a king. Well, we move on from the settings of the book to the scenes in the book. And I just want to run over these briefly, and then we'll be done today. I'm sorry, I'm just not feeling the best, and so I'm just going to be brief today. But the scenes. There's 5 scenes that I want you to notice here. Number 1 is a parent. In chapter 1, you have the parent. Hannah is a barren wife. She wants a family, of course. She seeks God, and God responds by giving her a son. And while many in her day, again, you look back at the time, we're talking about time of the judges in the beginning, many were unfaithful in her day. They were doing, as the last verse in Judges tells us, what was right in their own eyes. And God instead listens to Hannah. Hannah responds in a right way to God. She's doing what God has commanded her to do when many are unfaithful. And God blesses her with the son. Now you say, well, what makes Hannah different from the rest of the people in her time? Well, think back with me to Abraham and Hagar. God had promised Abraham, you're going to have a son. Instead of doing it God's way, Abraham did it his own way, married Hagar, and had a son by her. And could not Hannah have done that? Could not have Hannah had said, we're going to choose some other options here. We're going to go adopt the son. We're going to go take son. Not that adoption's wrong. I'm not saying that. She could have done it her own way, but she prayed to the Lord, and the Lord blessed. And so I think there's a picture there of her faithfulness, even when many others were not faithful, especially when you see her life in the backdrop of Eli, the priest. And so there's a parent. It starts off with this parent, and her influence, notice this, her influence brought about the strength of the nation. One parent's influence brought about the strength of the nation. If it weren't for godly Hannah, I wonder how Samuel would have turned out. How would have Samuel been as a leader? Would Samuel even have been a leader? But by her influence, Samuel was raised up and was a godly judge for many years in Israel. And so keep that in mind. We'll come back to, of course, all these stories. These are just the scenes, each picture, each scene that we find in the book of 1 Samuel. And so number 1 is a parent in chapter 1. Well, then we see a priest in chapter 2 through 4, a priest. As Eli is a lukewarm priest who desires neither evil, he doesn't do what's evil, but he doesn't do what is right necessarily either. He passively allowed his sons to engage in immorality. He was basically having affairs. His sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were having affairs with women in the temple, right outside the temple doors. They also desecrated the tabernacle, I should say, tabernacle at this time, tabernacle ministry. How so? Well, they were taking meat out of the flesh pot. In other words, what was supposed to be given to God and burnt for a sacrifice, which was maybe some of the more tender parts of the meat and so forth, they were taking from that. On top of that, some of it was supposed to be boiled and set aside, and they were supposed to take out of that first. And instead, they said, no, give us the meat before it's boiled, before it's seethed in the pot. We want that meat first. So they could probably cook it in their own ways. I don't know, maybe they wanted to go out back and have a barbecue instead. It probably tastes a lot better than boiled meat. But anyhow, in doing so, they desecrated God's tabernacle ministry. And because of that, they suffered punishment. God punished his sin in that he didn't stop his sons. Again, it wasn't that Eli was personally involved in doing wrong, but that he didn't stop his sons. He did wrong in the sense that he didn't do what he should have done as the high priest, as the chief priest in those days, and allowed his son to continue to sin. And God punished his sin with death and disinheritance. I just want to read one verse that highlights this. 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 35. It says, "And I will raise me up a faithful priest." This is God speaking through another man of God to Eli. "I will raise me up a faithful priest that shall do according to that which is in mine heart and in my mind, and I will build him a sure house, and he will walk before me and my anointed forever." I didn't read all the verses, but he also said, hey, your son's going to die, you're going to die as well. And God punished him, judged him for his sin. And eventually, God also said that, hey, your family lineage won't live long lives. So they'll die early deaths, and that's exactly what happened. And his influence, Eli's influence, brought destruction to the nation. And just, it's horrible. You say, how horrible? Well, a lot of people die because of Eli's sin. You say, how? Well, you read the next few chapters, chapters 4 and chapters 5, Israel's going out to battle with the Philistines, and what happens? They take out the ark of God to hopefully bring the power of God with them. God's not with them. God's anger is against them because of their sin. Their sin is separating them from God and from his power. And because of that, a lot of people in Israel are slain. Several thousand, if I remember right, somewhere around 30 to 40,000 people were killed because of their sin. That was the consequences of really one man's sin. If Eli had told his sons, you know what, out of the ministry, you can't do this because you've desecrated this. You need to go, or here's an offering, offer this offering. Instead, he allowed them, permitted them to continue this sin and desecrate the tabernacle. And because of that, the whole nation paid. Many people died because of that. Well, that's the priest, a parent, a priest. We also come to a prophet, and chapters 3 through chapter number 8, a prophet. Now, we're introducing Samuel, of course. From the beginning of his life, really, you start in chapter 1, but he's not so much highlighted because the focus is on Hannah, and then the focus is on Eli. You don't really get to that focus till chapter 3, chapter 4, you move forward to chapter 6 on Samuel's life. And so he's a prophet, and from the beginning of his life, he's dedicated by his mother, and really God's plans for him. It wasn't as if his mother had any special powers. Ultimately, it was God. God was the one that worked through his life. As much as we want our kids, to do, maybe want them to go into ministry, maybe want them to become this person or that person, and that's good, and we can help them and aid them. Ultimately, God has to work, and whatever God's plans are for their lives, we need to support them in that. And sometimes it's different from what, some parents want certain things. I want my kid to grow up and be this. And then God's like, no, I want them to go and do this. And we need to allow that to happen in their life and support them in that, I think. But he's a prophet. Serves under Eli at least until his death. I don't know how long Samuel served in the tabernacle. The Bible doesn't tell us. His ministry, as far as the Bible records, ends in the early chapters of Samuel. And so he serves under Eli at least until Eli's death. God raises Samuel to be a judge in Israel and also a prophet. And so not all prophets, when we think about a prophet typically we think of somebody giving a prophecy of something to come, something to take place in the future. But in Old Testament times, prophets also were kind of the messengers of God to the people for a present-day message. Not always a futuristic message, but a present-day message. And God often spoke through Samuel to the people, like he did, we just read in chapter 8. It wasn't anything necessarily futuristic so much as a prophecy, though God said, hey, this is what's going to happen. But it was a present-day message for the people, and Samuel was a prophet in that regard. You don't really, to my knowledge, there's no futuristic necessarily prophecies concerning, Samuel wasn't prophesying the Messiah to come or anything like that, but no, a preacher in his day, if you will, is what we mean by that. So not all prophets foretold events to come. Some just preached messages or messengers of God as to what Israel should do, much like we have preachers today. Well, as judge, he was a prophet too. He delivered a message, but as judge, he delivered Israel from their enemies. He gave judicial decisions as well. So throughout the book of Judges, you see a lot of judges, they went out and they kind of just defeated Israel's enemies. They brought Israel victory. But Samuel's kind of unique in that he gave judicial decisions as well, and we'll read some of that as we go throughout the book. But he was a judge. He gave decisions, and we see his sons who were not good judges. They took bribes to make decisions and so forth. We'll read some more of that as well. But we don't know for sure. It seems like he failed to raise godly sons that ultimately led for a demand to the king. The failure of the sons is what led to the demand for a king to be judged. Now, was that Samuel's fault? Well, I don't know. God did judge Eli for not raising his sons right. God did judge Eli for not reprimanding his sons. Why Samuel wasn't judged, I don't know. Evidently, the people recognized that Samuel was different from his sons and that they said, hey, your sons don't reign like you. They're not judges like you. They're taking bribes and so forth. So maybe it was something that happened after they were older. I don't know. Did Samuel not say anything to him? We don't know, but I know this. He had an opportunity to be an influence, and evidently somehow that failed. In what way, we don't know. God didn't choose to highlight that about his life, but he did about Eli's life. But it was his influence that not only brought that demand for a king, his ungodly sons, but his influence did keep the nation kind of afloat, if you will, during that last time of the judges. And it brought the change about in Israel to the kingdom. Again, his leadership bring Israel about to a kingdom and kingdom strength, because God used him to minister in Saul's life. God used him to anoint David, the two first kings of Israel. And so God used him in a great way despite his seeming failures. The Bible doesn't tell us he failed, but the implication there seems to be so. So he's a prophet, and he's preaching. He has a ministry of judging Israel, a ministry of preaching to Israel, and a ministry of anointing the kings of Israel. Something that just ran across my mind earlier as I was studying and I thought was interesting is that a lot of the first few kings of Israel were anointed by a prophet. Saul, David, Solomon. Remember, I can't remember which prophet it was or priest that anointed the first Solomon under King David. But then the following kings after those first three kings weren't necessarily anointed by people. With the exception of a few times where God told a prophet, hey, go anoint a king, a lot of those prophets just kind of came up of their own rather than being anointed by God, and perhaps that's some of the reason why you see the destruction of the kingdom, that they weren't God-focused in those days to follow. Well, you have a prophet. He's a judge. He rules. He preaches. He ordains these kings, if you will, and eventually he passes on the scene. And you come to now, we have a politician, a prophet. Or first off, you have a parent, a priest, a prophet, and now a politician, their first king of Israel. Now, he was a humble son. He was a very humble man, Saul was starting out. He was chosen for his physical appearance, though, not for who he was inwardly, but for his physical appearance. And he would soon turn from God's ways to choose his own ways. And you see that very clearly early on in his life. Saul reigned for 40 years. And I think sometimes we read the book of 1 Samuel, we think, well, it was just later, his latter years that, Saul messed up and turned away from God. But no, it was very early on in his ministry. Not long after he was king, he was a king after the people's heart. He was a king that the people thought was going to be best and not God's appointed king. And that's a big contrast between David and Saul. The people chose Saul. God chose David to be king. Well, he became very arrogant, as you know, very prideful. We'll see that throughout the book very clearly. He became indifferent. In other words, he was disobedient towards God and his word, and it led to his rejection by God early in his kingship. And again, he reigned for 40 years, but those years, many of them were spent facing the consequences of his sin and fulfilling his arrogant attitude, just how he felt and what he wanted accomplished. I have no doubts that if Saul had said, you know what, I've sinned, God, you take over the kingdom, let your other king that you've said you're going to appoint be raised up, that things would have gone a lot better for Saul in his life. He probably would have had the opportunity to be very influential in the next king. Maybe would have a place of authority under the next king. But instead it led to much death and destruction throughout the nation of Israel. And he died unsuccessfully repelling the enemies of Israel. After all, Israel had appointed a king. Why? To help us fight off our enemies. But over and over again, Saul had no power. Why? Because the Lord was not with Saul. And I think God was just making very clear to Israel, you can choose your own king, but without me, you are nothing. You can't win your battles without me. And so, a very clear picture all throughout the scriptures, especially in 1 Samuel, of the need for the Lord's help. Well, he died again after unsuccessfully repelling the enemies of the king of Israel. And, of course, Israel is very disappointed in what they thought they would find in a king. And that ends the book, by the way. Chapter 30 of 1 Samuel ends the book with Saul dying. And then you pick up with 2 Samuel with the reign of King David. But part of David's life, even though it's not the main focus, again, Saul is the main focus, part of David's life is captured in the last, I think it's chapter 18 on forward, chapter 15 on forward. And here's the last scene you find, or last scene you find is a persecuted poet. So you have the parent, the priest, the prophet, the politician, and now you have the persecuted poet. Because David's, even though he's been anointed king, his kingship has not really begun yet. He'll become king in 2 Samuel. But David was taken from the pasture, elevated to serve as second command only to the king. Again, he's the leader, the captain of thousands. And he's sent to lead the army out, and only to become, later on, the king's most wanted. And he lives a life in those very first, or really last 14 years of Saul's life, very first 14 years of his ministry, kind of as king. It's a life filled with trial, character building, we might say, as he goes from nothing to elevation, then to demotion and near death. He's the one most wanted guy in the nation, and then God is going to raise him up on his own way, of his own accord. And so he's a persecuted poet. A lot of psalms written during this time about David's feelings and his struggles during that 14-year period. We'll talk about some of those as we get to those passages, but he's a persecuted poet that we find there. And those are the different scenes that we'll see, the different lives that you get a picture of throughout the book of 1 Samuel. Well, next week we'll dive into chapter 1 and begin looking at some things there, all right? I need to end. I went longer than I even thought I would, so I thought we were going to finish early, but here we are. Thank you guys for being here, and we'll catch you next week, you that are online. We that are here, let's pray. Lord, we're thankful. We pray you'd help us, Lord. Help us to learn from the lives of people like Hannah, people like Eli, people like Samuel or Saul or David, Lord. Lord, help these to have an impact on our lives as we study them over the next several weeks. And Lord, throughout all this, may we realize that you are a gracious and merciful God, despite our faults and failures. Lord, help us now. Help preacher as he preaches. Give him the strength he needs. Help those that are sick. Lord, we ask all this in your name. Amen and amen. All right, you're dismissed. God bless you. Thank you for being here. We'll see you soon.